Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Max Hollein. I'm the Marina Kellen French Director and CEO of the Met. And I want to say this is a very special evening with special speakers, but really also with a great audience, an interesting audience, and an audience that really is deeply committed to museums, I think, and you're interested also in architecture and also in this whole complexity of this question of museum architecture in that context. And we want to talk about this more, about also the idea of museums as these unique civic spaces and places. And in that context, I would say that museums like the Metropolitan Museum play a distinct role in that idea of a convener. Museums bring people together, they bring objects together, they bring ideas together. And I think in an increasingly fragmented space that we all live in as a society, in a fragmented public sphere, museums offer an extraordinary promise. Yes, there are spaces for learning, for beauty, for contemplation, also for storytelling and knowledge, but also there are especially also resources for connection, for meaning, for coming together. And this is a powerful story. This is a powerful place to be, and I think it's also something that we see again and again is so needed, and people are, especially during times of challenges, come to these museums as spaces of that kind. And if you look back at our story, the Met story began in 1870. This is the year that we say we were founded, and we indeed were founded by a small group of New Yorkers. But we were founded by little less than an idea of wanting to have a museum. That group of New Yorkers back then had no collection, not a single work of art. They also had no building. And so from this, just an idea of a museum came then and grew one of the world's greatest cultural institutions, cherished certainly by generations. So its first home of this idea, and the first Metropolitan Museum, was a townhouse called the Dodsworth Building at 680 Fifth Avenue. The Met then moved into its initial structure in Central Park very soon thereafter. And obviously we would love to say that this museum, this building, was an instant success. But we don't have a lot of written records about the responses back then, but I have to say, unfortunately, one of the major responses that we have written is by a critic that called it a forcible example of architectural ugliness. Yeah? So that's basically the response that we first got about our building. And the reality, of course, is that that perception changed, indeed. And by the time it opened, so when this museum in Central Park opened, it was already too small for our collection. So that shows you already one of the big challenges also of museums per se, actually different to opera houses or theaters. Museums are per se spaces that grow. They are entities that grow because they keep collecting. So it basically, the architectural almost like challenge is also to prepare for that level of growth. So already at the beginning, when it then got opened, it was already too small for what we have. So from there, the museum's physical space continuously evolved and adapted to meet the growing collections and also visitors' needs. So if you look at this, the Richard Morris Hunt gave us the Grand Beaux-Arts facade, and also, of course, the landmark Great Hall. McKim, Mead and White designed 5 major wings in the early 20th century, completing the Fifth Avenue frontage, and then Kevin Roche drafted roughly a third of our current buildings as part of a master plan. So each of these additions that you see here, this growing museum, responded to what came before, continuously connecting, adapting, and expanding. Always, of course, not only a growing collection in mind, but an ever-growing audience, a public that increased for the museum. So like New York itself, a city shaped by immigrants and by diversity and reinvention, the Met's architecture also reflects a plurality of perspectives, of different cultures, of different languages, maybe in that sense, especially also architectural languages being applied and histories. So today, the Met's 21 wings, so it's really not one building, it's 21 wings, have been shaped by generations, each really contributing to a vision of an expanding civic space where traces of the past coexist with a present and very vitality, and with the idea of also manifesting the most current cultural voices as artists, but also as architects. So the building really reveals how New York has thought about art and about itself. It's kind of a palimpsest of ideas of New York architecture, New York understanding of art over more than a century. Also, what was once a facade might now and is now an interior wall, as you can see here in Petrie Court. Galleries may situate objects thousands of miles apart or centuries away next to one another. The Met really reminds us that a museum's form, its openness and its mass, its thresholds and its scale, these are shapes not only that shape our experience of art, but really, in a sense, also our experience of ourselves, of us as a public, and maybe also as us as a society. And we see that mirrored in many different ways. We, I think, take great aim also that this building and how we build it, who we build it for, and what kind of features it has, really represents also and translates civic ideals, openness, continuity, generosity. All of that should be part of the architectural experience of a museum in general, and certainly also of the Metropolitan Museum. The Met stands now at a moment of, again, major transformation. So over the next 10 years, the Met is investing about $1.3 billion to revitalize and change about a quarter of our galleries, while remaining fully open to the public. And I want to just kind of stress that, because often you hear about museums adding new wings, or museum reorganizing themselves. So we do that, but with the absolute mandate, the museum has to stay open. We need to continue to service our audiences. That makes also the building part more challenging, actually also more costly. But it really is, first and foremost, a service to our audience. We change galleries, we improve them, we build new architecture, but we make sure that the museum stays open. And on the other hand, in this context, the physical parameter of this museum is fixed. We don't and we can't move one more inch into Central Park. So it's a complex challenge to create this growth and these kind of changes within an existing already infrastructure. So this vision brings new galleries and innovative exhibition spaces, as well as really also fresh scholarship, new curatorial approaches, the work of our conservators, of our scientists, our educators, of our wider community to the fore, and it allows that to really gel into next meaningful ways. So this May, we reopened the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing, done by Y Architecture and Kuula-Pattihantas. In 2022, we introduced the 81st Street Studio to the lower right here by Coco Architecture. We are deep in construction for the galleries for ancient West Asia and ancient Cyprus by Nada and Nadatarani. So that's something that we will open in early 27. We are currently enhancing, and you see this in the lower middle slide, we're enhancing the study rooms of our Watson Library by Yangada Yada. And we are introducing new special exhibition spaces right by the Great Hall to highlight the Costume Institute's work. And both of these projects are opening next year, and the Great Hall project is done by Peterson Ridge office. And we are also reimagining visitor experiences in retail and dining in new areas. And then the new Tang Wing for Modern Contemporary Art will open in 2030, designed by Frida Escobedo. So all of this shows you already a very ambitious building, architecture, transformation project. Central to all of this is a collaboration with a new and a diverse generation of architects and designers. And I think that's just really important. And we do that together with our architects that we've partnered for a long time with Bayer Blinda Bella, our executive architects for more than a decade. So on our stage tonight, we will welcome Frida Escobedo of Frida Escobedo Studio, Miriam Peterson of Peterson Ridge Studio, Nada Terrane of Nada, Adam Weintraub of Coco Architecture, and Michael Young of Young and Ayada. The idea is really almost to represent all the different architectural thinkers, designers, companies that are currently working together with us. And they will be in conversation with Abraham Thomas, our Daniel Brodsky Curator of Modern Architecture, Design, and Decorative Arts. And I'm very much looking forward to that conversation. But before we do that, I would like to invite especially Jacob Moore, the Executive Director at the Architectural League, our co-organizer for tonight's program, and great friend of bringing this whole evening together, and would like to ask him to the stage to say a few words. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much to Max. As Max said, I'm Jacob Moore. I'm the Executive Director of the Architectural League of New York. We are, for those that you don't know, we are a small nonprofit dedicated to supporting transformational work in architecture and the allied fields that shape the built environment. We were founded here in New York just a mere 10 years after the Met, as we just learned, and as such feel a really strong affinity for its legacy and contemporary commitments. On behalf of the League, I want to share a few brief words of thanks before we get started. Everyone here at the museum has been so incredibly gracious ever since we approached them with a proposal to lift up the important and truly unique architectural work that they've been taking on under Max's leadership. Jalen Hernandez, Eli, and Brett Gaillard were key to early stages of the conversation. Mariana Siciliano and Inga Drogen-Mueller have been wonderful partners along the way ever since. And at the League, a very special thanks goes to our entire program team, but in particular to Anne Rieselbach. Without her insights and insistence, none of us would be sitting in this room today, so really grateful to her. For the League, this event forms part of our current work lecture series, which is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, in partnership with the City Council and by the New York State Council on the Arts, with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature. And then beyond tonight, and beyond current work, absolutely none of this would be possible without the support of Architectural League members, inspiration, audience, and collaborators for all that we do. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to check out our website, sign up for our newsletter, and join us as members. I have to say also, the League is pleased to offer AIA continuing education units for this program. There'll be a QR code available to scan on your way out for anybody who's interested to get those credits. Now, more importantly, onto the substance of the evening, and just extending a little bit of what Max already so eloquently laid out. The League has long understood and championed the important work that happens when art and architecture meet. As we sit here tonight on ancestral Lenape homelands, a stone's throw from the ruins of Seneca Village across the park, in this incredible Beaux-Arts, modern, and increasingly contemporary masterpiece of a building, we know that the built environment affects our understanding of the world, our sense of agency within it, and the ways in which society does or does not value differing or dissenting perspectives. In other words, the built environment is a big way in which society expresses who belongs, where, and how. And art helps us think through the more fundamental question, as Max said, of who we are in the first place. Understanding this, designing for and with difference at all scales and with great sensitivity, is of the utmost importance today. And design work at an encyclopedic museum represents such an incredible opportunity to emphasize this way of thinking. And under Max's leadership, the architecture that we'll hear more about tonight really is embodying this collaborative, infrastructural, plurivocal approach, which is an approach that, in my view, is key when we're talking and thinking about civic space. So I won't get ahead of what all of the architects we're so lucky to be hearing from on the same stage tonight will share, but I do want to note that they, and all of the others that weren't able to be included tonight, including actually Bayer Blinder-Bell, who Max mentioned, also whose office the League will be getting access to tomorrow night. So for any League members, please do join us at our after-hours event tomorrow at BBB. But all of these architects really do embody what I love most about architecture, which is that it speaks not with one voice, but with many, and it encourages us to grapple at once with meaning, difference, and the art of living together. We're so grateful to be in conversation with each of them and with each of you in this way this evening. So with that, Max already introduced Abraham and the architects, so I'd just like to invite them to come out on stage and join us, and Abraham will take it from here. Thank you again for being here tonight.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you, Max, for your wonderful introductions. And thank you to all of you for being here this evening. It is so great to be here on this stage with Michael, Adam, Miriam, Nader, and Frida, who are so instrumental in this exciting period which Max outlined for us earlier, this moment of kind of utter transformation of the architecture of the Met. And we've never had you all together in one place on stage. This is very exciting at this moment when we are really reflecting on the history of the museum's architecture. And I've always been fascinated with this idea that this is not just one building, it's essentially 21 buildings kind of created through a series of infills and adaptations. So this building really feels like a miniature city or a kind of campus of sorts. So we thought that this evening would be an opportune moment to think about this notion of civic space and the unique qualities of civic space as it exists in a museum, which is kind of always a sort of combination of truly public realm, but also partly private, controlled, sort of defined space. And for me, what I find fascinating with the 5 projects that we're going to talk about today is the fact that they all talk about civic space in very different ways. They're all of very different scales, contexts, types of audiences in some cases. And so we thought this would be a great opportunity to think about what ties these projects together in terms of how we think about space, objects, people, and ideas. So we're mainly going to have a pretty free-flowing conversation for this evening, but we thought it would be fun to sort of kick off with some brief, rapid-fire icebreakers. And so we've asked the architects to respond to this theme by thinking about this idea of what does civic space mean in the context of museums and the Met. And we've asked them to come up with a precedent project or a project of inspiration which has helped inform their project, which they will also talk about in their this little icebreaker moment. So I'm going to kick off with Michael, if that's all right, to start us off. Thank you.
Sounds great. All right, I got the controller. Okay, so as a precedent here, we're scanning down the ceiling of the Staatsbibliothek by Hans Scharoun in Berlin. But many of you probably know what the precedent is here. It's an amazing library, but the precedent is Wim Wenders' film Wings of Desire. And one of the amazing things about Wings of Desire is, yes, okay, the angels have access to our inner monologues. They're there to hear our thoughts through our daily troubles and our daily successes. But where do they congregate? They get together in the library. Because in the library, we're all alone together with our most intense contemplative moods and ways in which we are dealing with the thoughts and researches that we deal with when we are in the space of a library. So what does a space of a library have to do with a library and a museum? So the Watson Library, which many of you know, if you do not know it, it is exactly where we are right here on the other side of the staircase. You go through the Velez Blanco courtyard and you'll enter the Watson Library. One of the greatest art history libraries in the world. Anybody can go in there and see anything they want to see from the collection. You just need to sign up for a library card. And what we are doing with the transformation of the reading room, of the study room, is a space that has both the ability to be a place of research, a place of contemplation, but also a place where workshops around the book can happen, a place where discussions around the exhibitions can happen. Because it's a good thing to remember that in a museum, the books that are there within the Watson Library are works of art. And they are incredible things that you are lucky enough to be able to spend time with. The other thing that we like to think about when we are designing this space is that actually the book, in a way, comes both before and after the artworks that we see. Many of the things we see in the Met, we've seen published somewhere. They've kind of put a thought into our mind before we get there. We see the art, and then actually we see things we didn't know about, and then we want to know more. So what is the status of the ways in which libraries, spaces of research, spaces of reading, begin to become spaces that enliven our civic relationship to the museum, to each other, and to the knowledge that we gain from experiencing cultures throughout time? Just to say a few words, because our timer is timing down, what the study room is in its redesign is we have taken all of the bookshelves. The Watson Library, by the way, was the first modernist addition, renovation to the Met in the history of kind of buildings inside of buildings, volumes inside of volumes. And so we've taken every single bookshelf that's been there for the past 60 years, we put it on the wall. So the walls are made of the bookshelves. And then into those bookshelves walls, there is a book-matched pattern of book marbling. Book marbling is the technique that you have between the cover and the start of the text as a kind of way in which abstraction somehow moves us between the material world and the world of ideas. And so we have book-matched book marbles on the bookshelves, and the bookshelves made a wall into which we are putting new bookshelves to become a cabinet for you to begin to research together as a civic space within the Met.
And now, Adam, thank you.
So I'm going to jump from Wings of Desire to Amsterdam, the streets of Amsterdam. The grainy image that you can see on the left is one of just 700 playgrounds that the Dutch architect Aldo van Eyck built in Amsterdam after the war. He was working as an architect in the public works department, and his approach as an architect was to insert children's play areas into the interstitial spaces in the bombed-out residential quarters of the city. These irregularly shaped sites were often too small or marginalized to be considered of any civic value. But with these playgrounds, Van Eyck reimagined a new child-scale space within the existing fabric of the city. Another critical aspect of Van Eyck's designs for children is that they were open-ended. If you put an empty boat in the middle of a playground, the kids will think that they have to play captain, and if they don't play captain, somehow they're breaking the rules of the game. But if you keep the element abstract enough, it can be a boat, it can be a horse, it can be a spaceship. Their imagination completes the project. But also these playgrounds were not limited to children and became public sculpture, intergenerational social condensers, and successful urbanism. Jumping now to the Met, the 81st Street Studio plays a similar role at the Met as Van Eyck's playgrounds played in Amsterdam. We designed the space and activities to connect with the wider museum without imitating or replicating the museum. In considering its civic role, we focused not only on the community of museum visitors, but also on the community within the Met. Most children's spaces in museums are hidden from view or an afterthought, but the 81st Street Studio is front and center, sandwiched between the garage, the 81st Street entrance, and the group tour entry, as well as the gift shop. Throughout the design process, Max would challenge us to make it even more open by asking, what do you see from the outside? Our designs for children are always based on a multi-sensory approach. As children, we rely equally on all of our senses, but as we get older, the visual tends to take over. At the 81st Street Studio, we constantly introduced multi-sensory experiences with many unexpected activities from please touch walls to ramps to percussion instruments and air organs. Working with Heidi Holder and the Met's education team, we explored ways to conceptually connect the space with the rest of the museum. The question was the role of science and materials in the Met's collection and how artists manipulate materials in their work. This gave us the structure to connect not only with the artwork in the galleries, but also the structure, but also the less visible departments in the museum, from curators to conservationists. The idea of bringing community into the museum typically focuses on local populations or tourists, but the 81st Street Studio also made us aware of the power of the community within the museum, whether it was the material orchestra formed by many of the curators from the instrument department or the conservation scientists donating insects found in this collection for the microscope slides. In the last 2 years, I believe we have hit well over 200,000 visitors to the space and have been able to witness the civic impact in real time. One unexpected surprise is the number of repeat visitors. There are regulars who know the names of the volunteers. Another interesting pattern is that kids come with their caregivers, but then want to return with their parents, or they come with their parents and want to return with their grandparents. This intergenerational learning is certainly not new to museums, but we always expect the parents to be dragging the kids to the museum. Here it is the reverse, and the kids have become the new ambassadors to the Met. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. And now, Miriam.
Thank you. As I was thinking about what are some defining characteristics of civic space, I thought about two primary things. One, which Max already alluded to, they begin with an idea and the creation of a physical space, usually an exterior space that's open and accessible. That space is then surrounded by an aggregation of buildings and uses, public buildings, religious buildings, architectural elements like arcades, different interiors, pavilions. And in the creation of these things over time, they are ultimately adaptable. So they kind of embody, I think, some contradictory ideas. They're planned, but also unplanned, controlled, but also uncontrollable, and really adaptive and lived-in spaces that support culture and society. And so as part of our design process, we looked very deeply into the architecture of the Met. And for me, this building really represents a kind of architectural manifestation of all of these things. At the time when the first building was established here in Central Park, that first idea, there was really not much else in this area. It was 70 years after the commissioner's plan that gridded out the island of Manhattan. And I think there was something incredibly kind of optimistic and civic in the establishing of this institution here in this park. The cultural center of Manhattan was still in Madison Square Park at the time, and so it was a kind of optimistic investment in culture, but also, I think, in establishing one of the first civic spaces that would make up a network of civic spaces in New York City. If you look at this, which I think it kind of can read into it, it's literally a collage of archival and historic drawings. The building was made through a minimum of 5 different master plans, none of which was realized in its entirety. It's composed of 21 distinct buildings, but every time a new architecture was introduced into the museum, there was a kind of intergenerational collaboration. So regardless of new architectural styles or materials or ideals, there were architectural languages and elements that really tied the museum together. These are in the form of long views, enfilades, the articulation of thresholds. And so seeing through these multiple layers of the architectural history is a way of also tying together, I think, all of the different departments in the museum. So the building is kind of almost a microcosm or reading of the mission of the museum itself. Our project is very difficult to describe in a single image. We cross over 6 different eras of Met construction. We are not representing a single department. We're creating the new Condé M. Nast galleries, which will house the Costume Institute spring shows opening next year. But bridging the Great Hall is the other part of our project. So it's called the Great Hall Gallery because we are pressed up against this incredibly important civic space within the museum. In many ways, it is the kind of Roman Forum or Greek Agora of this museum. It's a central space that is not programmed for a particular art collection. And we are weaving very carefully, articulating new thresholds, digging deep into the history of the architecture to create new streets, interior, and new visual connections across multiple program spaces.
Thank you, Miriam. And now, Nadir.
Good evening. In many ways, both Miriam and Max made a great introduction for us already, and that is that the so-called 21 buildings form a kind of urbanism that is similar to what is displayed on the screen as modern-day Split in Croatia. The square part at the center of the image displays what was once Diocletian's palace, built in the 3rd century, not far from Salona. And essentially, it's a matte building conceived as a retirement home. It's large, admittedly, and can house some military garrison. But when Salona was attacked by the Avars and the Slavs in the 7th century, I believe it was, the citizens of the city took refuge in what was Diocletian's palace, releasing it from its latent property, that is, to become a piece of urbanism. It went from essentially a house to a city, and if you look at the remnants, the archaeological remnants of what you're seeing, it has civic spaces, plazas, courts, and certain configurations that make it much like the way that we experience the Met. Now, our project occurs just south of the Great Hall, those great vaults that are part of a civic extension of New York City. But the problem is that we also occur at the rift between two separate eras, and that involves a 1 meter difference between the northern and the southern part of our site. Currently, in storage spaces, there are essentially small, limited space, but we were able somehow to smuggle in a civic ramp, a ramp that gives equal parity to both the Cypriot wing as well as the ancient West Asia wings, that make for a more graceful entry into these spaces. And therefore, in a way, we celebrate the rift between these two eras. Ultimately, what we bring together is a notion of civicness as accessible space, not in the guise of the Disability Act, but something that is architectural. And it is all capped by an extension of the very vaults of the Great Hall that extends some 150 feet over the ancient West area, Asia wings. Frida.
Great. Thanks, Nadir.
Thanks, Nadir. And actually, since you were mentioning the idea of access, I was thinking about how civic spaces not only require that, but also they need to provide the space for representation. To me, that's the full access that we need to provide. So the image that came to mind for me was Tlatelolco with the Plaza de las Tres Culturas. It's in the center of the city, and as you can see in this image, it becomes almost a theater where you can see all these layers of history coexisting in the same space and colliding into one. There's the ceremonial center of Tlatelolco, which was already itself built in layers of history. Like one layer after the other, these pyramids were constructed to achieve their form. Then we have the convent of Santiago Tlatelolco, which was built in 1521. And some of the fragments of the temples that were destroyed during the conquest were used to build this temple. So there's already a process of translation and adaptation to create this new language. And then finally, we have the modern city in the background with the Mario Pani compound with housing units and some other services. So at some moment, of course, the pre-Hispanic layer was covered, but then it was unearthed, and then this beautiful moment started to happen. And to me, what's meaningful about it is not only that we're able to read how the process of transformation in a city is condensed in this small space, but also how even the buildings have that embedded into their own DNA. And I think we all have that shared ground. Like, we believe that the Met has also that characteristic in its DNA. And when we were thinking about the new Tang Wing, that idea of layering was also aligned with the concept of weaving, which I think is also an idea that we all share. And it's not just about weaving the circulation areas and to give full access for people to experience art, but also to think about how we can create some threads that would allow for people to feel represented in spaces that might have been intimidating in other moments. So we are trying to create better connections by changing, for example, circulations that were previously occupied only by service areas, and transforming them into gallery spaces that would create this connective tissue that would create this overlap between Tang Wings. And very much like Nader, we're in these crossroads between different wings. We have 19th century European painting, we have special exhibitions, America, Oceania, and Africa. So all of these things are converging in this beautiful corner, but we also have the relationship to the city and the park, because we are at the southwest corner of the building. So the idea of being able to connect with these elements was also important, and therefore the idea of porosity became also relevant. So that's why the facade opens, becomes lighter, and has a possibility to absorb some of the landscape and to remind us where we are located, both not only at the Met, but also in the city.
Great. Thank you, Frida, and thank you to all of you. It's so interesting to get these insights into the projects here at the Met, but also such wonderful personal kind of reflections on these other projects or precedents that have sort of sparked something for you in terms of this theme of civic space. Frida, I loved how you talked about this idea of weaving and this kind of idea of contending with these layers of history and sort of blending together these different periods of architecture. And that seems to be a very strong theme throughout all of these projects. And I also love the kind of the visual connection between Nader's image of Diocletian's palace and the sort of satellite view that Max had shown, and also Miriam, the wonderful sort of collage, the sort of patchwork of these architectural drawings showing the kind of this kind of woven tapestry of a museum or a civic space. So I would love to kick off with that, maybe starting with you, Miriam, this idea of how one contends with these layers of time and history and these moments of adaptation and infill, and how you, with a project, with the Great Hall Project, which, even though it's called the Great Hall Project, it's actually, you're surgically dealing with other spaces around the Great Hall and leaving a landmarked space untouched, essentially. And I would love to hear you reflect further on how you've dealt with uncovering these histories in some way with that project.
Yeah, well, I think there's something, the word collaboration obviously comes up time and time again. I think it's amazing, by the way, that we're all here. We're kind of, with Max's leadership and vision, this generation of architects now collaborating in a very different way inside of this building. I think to work in this building, in this institution, you have to have a very particular idea about history. It's not about erasure. That's sort of at the spirit of the Met too, which is, of course, preserving artifacts of human creation from the earliest civilizations to contemporary acquisitions. And so we've really been thinking not so much about newness in an isolation, but thinking about history as from the detail of a material to larger moves like uncovering openings that used to exist between spaces that we're now excavating and reconstituting anew. A kind of layering of old and new, a coexistence of these things as a way of collaborating with the building and with the architecture. We've been very fortunate. The museum here has incredible archives, photos, drawings, and so the process has been in some ways very forensic. From a macro level, thinking about these kinds of master plans all coming together, down to construction drawings from McKim, Mead and White, or how Roche and Dinklu altered the Great Hall in particular ways. And so in order to intervene in these kind of complex structures, it requires a really deep understanding of the architecture and a kind of collaboration on all levels, structural, material, detail. How you touch a piece of architectural history here has extreme significance. And so it's I think, a multi-scale process for us.
Interesting. And yeah, and if anyone else wants to respond to that, feel free. But it sort of kind of leads me to another thought I had, which was this idea of when you're dealing with these layers of history and these patchworks, what often emerges are these very interesting, sometimes awkward, but charged areas of threshold and these kind of moments of transition where we're maybe moving between different galleries or between a sort of more of a utilitarian gathering space into a space with an art collection in it. And that seems to be very key to both Frida and Nader with your projects. With Frida, I know with the Tang Wing, you're contending with several other collection departments and other kind of wings, as we might say. And Nader, it's interesting how you've articulated this piece of urbanism, this kind of slice that cuts through and connects between the north and south ends of your gallery. So perhaps I could invite you both to sort of explore that a little bit more and sort of reflect on that idea of the threshold or the power of the transition spaces that we have in the museum.
Should I go ahead? Okay. Well, as I was describing a little bit, we already have several connections, and I face the same challenge as you that created opportunities of connecting, but also a challenge in reorganizing the back of house movement and providing new spaces that were adequate for presenting contemporary art. Some of the spaces that we have right now are very compressed or not with the right proportions. So we had to reorganize and shift some of these labs to create those proper spaces. And it was a delicate play of what do you preserve and what do you need to change. That's why the weft and warp become relevant, because it's like creating these lines of continuity that creates like the basic partiture of the partie. And then you have the weft, how can you create variation, rhythm, surprise, texture, friction. So of course we have a resulting scheme where we have different sizes of galleries that could be adequate for many different formats that would allow for those moments of surprise that already happen in the museum to continue to exist. Like we were describing, most of us describing the museum as a micro city, or a medieval town, or a place where you can get lost, which can be wonderful, but also can be very disorienting. So how to connect into this idea that you're constantly moving through times, geographies, different collections, and you're able to locate yourself into space. So by adding these moments where you're connecting with exterior, it became almost like the compass that you needed to reorganize all the interior spaces. So interior and exterior are always like the connecting vessels.
It's important to understand also that at one level, our charge is to create the scenography for the ancient West Asia collection as well as the Cypriot collection. And there's a narrative that goes with that. But there is a kind of contemporary archaeology that has to do with either the revelation of the building and the building's histories. And part of that comes in the recognition that there are moments in which you can maybe reveal the scars or the fissures that opportunistically can be revealed at the right time or the right place. In our case, it's important to remember that we are in or around the Jaharis court, where the Greek and Roman collection are below. So we're in the space of the vault, never knowing it's right outside. So, but we're also in the threshold that we showed. We're behind the Assyrian court. So that becomes an opportunity for us to sort of break open a reveal to show what's happening behind the scenes of the tablets that are on display in the gallery. Some of this will be explained, of course, but the notion is that you're seeing both historic and contemporary construction within the context of that fissure.
And, oh, Michael, do you want to please jump in, please?
Yeah, look, we're all architects, so this word threshold comes up, and we're gonna go for it. Just maybe one other thought, because Miriam brought up the word enfilade. For all of us who are architects, we know this term. For those who aren't, essentially rooms which are sequenced room after room after room without a corridor to break you from one space to another. But within anything that is enfilade, what matters most are the thresholds. How those spaces are broken for a moment, for a gap, for just sort of a pause as you move from room to room. And one of the interesting things to think about having 5 different architects doing 5 different buildings, because in a certain way, they are 5 different buildings all collected within this one building, is the threshold that sequences them back into the other network of rooms and spaces and experiences of the Met. And so how that all becomes negotiated and orchestrated, I encourage, many of you probably have already done this before. If you haven't, when you're in one gallery, look into the next gallery, because the curators are incredible. What they're doing in the ways in which they're framing the next gallery from the gallery you're in, that's the threshold of the enfilade that sequences galleries. And then what both Frida and Nadir are bringing up, the architects are sequencing eras of architecture as if they are like big period rooms. In a certain weird way, the best way to think about this is the period rooms just down on the other side here, because you're moving through sequences of interiors which are specific to a moment in time, but then you're also working through the thresholds that link them together as a story of scenography. And just to kind of finish this in a second, when you come to see the door of the Watson Library, get over your library fear. This is a threshold that many of us have, and just open that door, because there's a world in there, and it's amazing. And that's a threshold which I guess in our project we're trying to open up, to loosen a little bit, and to reconnect within the rest of the experience of the Met.
Okay, I'm just going to say something too, because I think you brought up an important point, which is the enfilades that are at this museum are different from a typical enfilade, which would have been designed really all at one time. So thinking about, galleries at the Louvre or even the Uffizi, the thresholds are repeated and repeated and repeated, and the architecture, even though they're spaces that are containers for perhaps different, curation, are actually self-similar. And so what's so unique about this building is that you have this recognizable device, but it's actually connecting through completely different things all the time. And that's what makes it, I think, really dynamic and exciting. And you're now creating a new world behind a threshold. We're actually creating a threshold immediately opposite Velez Blanco on the other side of the stairs that's going to connect into our gallery. And so these microscopic changes sometimes have enormous impacts and effects that are lasting on the museum experience. And it's an incredibly exciting and kind of rich world to be living in as architects, I think.
I love how both of you actually have brought up this idea of the kind of tension within the threshold, especially when you're contending with, as Miriam and Michael, you both mentioned, the space of Velez Blanco in front of Watson I've always been fascinated with, because it is such a grand courtyard space. It's a public space, part of the continuation of the galleries, but then visitors pass by and they perhaps aren't even aware of or haven't been actively looking out for the Watson Library. And I wondered, Michael, as you sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier on, but have you tried to consciously sort of rupture that a little bit and sort of puncture that kind of tension of this very perhaps intimidating facade of a sort of a 16th century Spanish facade that contains this wonderful space of learning and exploration?
Well, one of the one of the things when you enter into the new renovation of the Watson Library, there will be a new circulation desk and a kind of new entry sequence. And in a way, the Watson Library is its own kind of period room of sorts, because it was a sort of mid-century modernist addition, the first modernist addition to the Met, in terms of the sequencing of now all of these different architectural styles. But I have to say that maybe puncture is not the word we would use. We would use maybe something link or join, to show and to share that this is another room inside a room. It's another experience inside of an experience. It's another moment in which you can engage the collection of the Met. This time, within the study room, the books are in their majority related to the exhibits that have been or are currently here at the Met. So a moment of pause, of walking into a library and walking into a space where you can look at a book about what you've just seen or about what you're going to see, and how does that enrich your experience of this entire institution. And so welcoming that link and opening that up, loosening that turn of the cover to that which you're going to be looking at. I mean, these are all analogies, but at a certain level, a threshold is that sort of movement from the world of the material to the world of the mind. And in that, hopefully the library begins to link those things together.
Maybe I could add also is that the equation between threshold and a museum often results in the presumption of categories within a museum. That is the idea that this room is about the 18th century and the other room is about, the silk collection or the other. So one of the things that occurred in our dialogue with the various curators that we were working with is that we discovered a much more fluid historical and cultural lineage, or sets of lineages that connected the Mediterranean with the ancient West Asia cultures, such that by breaking down the walls and setting up more provisional platforms on the ground, much like this red carpet, as areas of connectivity, we were able somehow to build narratives that have to do with how these cultures influence each other, less so as distinct and absolute categories, but more like ways in which we influence each other as we talk to each other, except over centuries.
There are very specific material choices that you've made, which am I right in understanding that reinforces these connections, but also perhaps
provisional,
yeah.
but breaking down the walls, and therefore our thresholds effectively break down what we would think of as the doorway, the conventional doorway. Yeah.
Some of these discussions make me think a lot about the sort of role of the visitor and the public in terms of how they navigate and contend with these spaces and these sort of propositions that are being developed here at the museum. And I was really struck, Adam, with your great example of Van Eyck's playgrounds in Amsterdam, the fact that these were 400 or so bomb craters that were all adapted into these playgrounds. And so it got me thinking a lot about how in this museum, mostly because we have developed over 150 years through these partly by intention, partly by provisional kind of strategy, we have these spaces that often get utilized by the public in a way that's not necessarily intended by us. And one of my favorites is walking, when I come to work, when I'm leaving at the end of the day, just seeing how the front steps of the Met have become an entirely different type of kind of public space and civic realm, not necessarily by design of the museum, but it's just become a space that the public have utilized. And so it made me think a little bit about the idea of these playgrounds that you mentioned, Adam, but also the fact that the 81st Street Studio has such a strong idea of agency, play, exploration. It's sort of truly a free-form space, not structured by necessarily objects and didactics, but something very different. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
And the other aspect of Van Eyck's playgrounds is he saw this as urbanism, but from the child's perspective and from that scale. And I think it's, looking at the examples of all these projects, you can't handle the Met as one building. It has to be these multiples. And, so maybe these small surgical insertions are a way of changing the Met without leveling it, for want of a better word. But in terms of the kids, that's one of the things we love most about the space is coming and seeing what they do, which we never expected. And that just adds to the magic of the space, that they will not use it the way we might have imagined. So it's always evolving. And I think that speaks to why there's the idea of the recurring visitors. And I think for museums, it shouldn't be the one stop. You go and tick it off your list, you've done the Met. So how do we get visitors who repeat visitors, coming back for a new experience, but maybe the same space, and not just relying on changing exhibits, but relying on what we can offer them in the space of the museum.
Yeah, it also makes me think a lot about this idea of how visitors, when they enter through the sort of so-called portals of the museum, there's this sense of kind of behavioral change because there are certain rules and there are certain spaces that are defined. And I wonder, this is a question really for all five of you, with any of your projects, has there been this sense of almost anticipating how behavior changes, anticipating how there might be a totally undefined way in which they adapt to these spaces, or have there been anything in these projects where you found spaces which are sort of so undefined, you've kind of almost left it to the agency of the visitor, and through the kind of idea of community and gathering, something completely new might emerge. So I just was, if anything comes up for any of you.
Actually, for all that is planned and choreographed in a museum, the curators of ancient West Asia have a very explicit agenda to create a Babylonian court where the furniture is movable and is stageable for completely different events. Contrary to what one might normally do as looking through artifacts, this is a space for installations, for lectures, for roundtables, for a scenario of things. And therefore, the furniture in that particular area has its own character. In other words, it doesn't look like seating or platforms, but is a more abstract version of objects that can be interpreted in many different ways. And therefore, the agency of its audiences may force it and allow it to do many different things.
I was just going to say, I think, there's something back to kind of what I was thinking about in terms of civic spaces not being able to be fully controlled or planned. I think that's kind of, in my experience here so far, a reality of some museum spaces. The Great Hall was originally conceived of as a gallery, but it was also an entrance, and it was immediately kind of considered to not be the greatest gallery. No matter how much you try to turn the Great Hall into a kind of perfect modern entry point into the museum with all of the necessary layers of security and ticketing and wayfinding, it's never going to be perfect because that's not possible. And I think that's one of the most amazing things about it. It might frustrate a museum visitor to come into the Great Hall and feel suddenly overwhelmed, not only by the architecture, but all of the different pathways of people weaving through it, but it's also one of the things that makes it a great space. So I think welcoming, trying to plan as best as you can, but also accepting the fact that spaces like this are occupied and lived in by people, and they're never going to be able to be controlled completely. And that's part of the beauty of them.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I wonder, Miriam, also, because your project will be creating more of these areas of permeability to the sort of street and to the public realm more directly that aren't going up the grand steps at 82nd Street. So I wonder if that also, you imagine, will be, because you're really extending the public realm into the museum almost, will that, in some way play into what you're describing?
I mean, talking about kind of accessibility and welcomeness, the second part of our project will create an entrance into the museum on grade with the street as an extension of the plaza. It'll be visibly porous to the street as well. And I think just provides options, choices that are equal and will really change the way that people arrive and move through the museum through this new entry point. What I'm excited about, now, if you're not able to walk up the steps of 82nd Street, you'll go through 81st Street near Adams Project, and you'll kind of come into the museum in the middle of the Greek and Roman galleries. But in the future, entering through this new on-grade, open, ticket-free zone of the museum will funnel you into the Great Hall, and you will kind of enter into this same mixing chamber as everyone else. And it will create a more kind of equal and accessible experience of the museum overall.
I know, Michael, with the Watson Library study room, I love that the idea for that space will be, in addition to it being this study space, it will be a bit more of a free-form space for events, I think either for kind of student groups or scholars, but also I think perhaps for the general public as well. So I wonder if you could sort of help us kind of understand better the sort of idea of the flexibility of that space and how you imagine that changes behavior and living in a space like that of research.
Yeah, one thing to say is that Watson has an incredible program of workshops where many different groups, from school groups to experts to visiting groups to open to the public, come and talk with curators, book preservationists, and begin to study these. Again, I call them works of art because they are. And I think one of the interesting and amazing things about a library within a museum is you're here to see works of art, and you often see them with a visual edge where you're standing with your hands behind your back in a way, looking at everything. Watson, you can touch this stuff. You can get into a kind of physical relationship with the ways in which our histories are shared, and our histories are recorded, and our histories are transmitted to future generations. And so, yeah, discussions, seminars, ways in which new acquisitions become displayed as exhibitions in and of themselves. This is part of what the library does within the Met. But I also wanted to kind of bring up, as this sort of theme of civic space comes throughout the day, we tend to think of those as large spaces of public gathering, the city in a way, as an urbanism that is there for us to share things together as a collective. But I'd like to include things like the Met. And we as New Yorkers, this is a civic space for us. My two sons are sitting here, and their entire life they've been coming to the Met. So they can find their way through the Met in a way that's kind of, we speak about its labyrinthian complexities, but these two can navigate to Arts and Armor in like heartbeat. But I say that because it's super important. The library's tied into this, the 81st Street is tied into this. Each of these interventions is tied into this because this is a place in which we are educating future generations of New Yorkers, yeah, but of many people, of a way in which they begin to relate to their world, their interior world, their shared world of culture, the ways in which aesthetics transforms and influences and shifts between things. So to be able to come here and engage that within the mind and as a discussion within a family and as a discussion within a city, I mean, what else could we want from a civic space than something that does that?
I loved, Michael, by the way, that you used Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire as your sort of precedent or inspiration. I love the way in which that tracking shot kind of brings together these individual moments of study, reflection, contemplation, but because it's sort of stitched together like a tracking shot, you have this wonderful sense of the collective idea of study and reflection and just being together in a space like that. And this, I think, is a key theme with all of these projects, all five, this idea of the, how in a museum space, being a civic space, we often have this combination of personal reflection, study, spending time with a single work, also, watching other people in galleries, observing how other people are interacting and having a kind of sense of communal gathering. And that, I think, applies just as much to a study space, to a play space where there's sort of individual play and sort of collaborative play, and of course to kind of areas of public realm and kind of galleries with objects. So this is really for any of you to kind of, I'd love to know if this sort of sparks off something in terms of your projects and this idea of the individual and the collective and how that has been navigated or sort of negotiated.
I can speak a little bit to how the curatorial narratives conspire to become architectural events that mediate between compression and expansion. Compression being the space of the individual, expansion, the space of the collective. In the Ancient West Asia collection, there's a particular set of artifacts related to Hassanlu, which is a place in contemporary Iran, attacked and burned centuries ago. The magic of this place is that all of its artifacts, because they were burned, were preserved as is. The fire served as a preservative, if you wish. And so all of these are contained within a very, one could say claustrophobic, but dense passage, a threshold between two other collections where one's encounter with them can only be personal. It no longer allows for the collective in that space because it's also an embodiment of the, you know, the ugly underbelly of war, oppression, and you know, colonialism, if you wish. But it's a moment in time that is being framed, forcing, if you wish, an individual reflective moment.
There was something we said quite a bit a few years ago during this pandemic we had, that we're all alone together. And I think we've also used that phrase often with our current mediated realm of accelerated deluge of images through social media. And one of the things that happens, I think, in a museum is that we are all alone together, but it's the together that begins to become stressed as opposed to the alone. Because the contemplation that happens is often that which is internal to the experience of works of art, but we're doing it together. And that, I think, is, maybe this is the compression and expansion that you're speaking to, Nader. How an architecture allows us that space, that freedom, that moment to have a kind of physical experience with work is one of its kind of fundamental gifts. That you do not feel like you are funneled through. You do not feel like this is something that is there just for its consumption, but it gives you the ability to be alone and pause. But in that, I guess, moment, to realize we're all doing it together, collectively, civically. And that's an architectural problem, it's a curatorial problem, it's an organizational problem, it's a perceptual problem, a psychological problem. But it's an amazing thing when a building begins to try to operate at that level. And I think each of these projects, at some moment, you're thinking about where are you giving pause and where are you bringing together. And that compression expansion is an architectural question.
Well, I just want to say this has been such a wonderful insight into all 5 projects. And I think, Michael, you summed up so well this idea of being alone together, together alone, and this idea of community and gathering. I mean, for me, it's been a real privilege just to get an insight into each of your projects, but also understanding better how they will work together as over the next 5, 10 years we build these projects. So thank you so much, and I hope it's been really insightful for everyone else as well. So Michael, Adam, Miriam, Nader, Frida, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to everyone else for joining us, and I want to also extend a special thanks to the Architectural League for their great collaboration on this event. It's been wonderful working with you, but my main thanks really goes to the 5 of you. Thank you for these amazing contributions to the future of architecture at the Met. Thank you.